There's a couple of things that we have to do when we take pictures of something we like, and one of them is to take at least 3 exposures. The main exposure that the camera wants to take, and then you have to force it to overexpose and underexpose, and that's the way that you get information, all the information you need in order to make a good painting. Whenever I see shows and I see white clouds, I know it's a photograph, because whenever you take a picture with a camera, the clouds usually block out white. And clouds and all the detail in clouds have so much to do with how great a painting can be, which is kind of the title of my demo today, which is protecting the highlights and protecting your shadows. And this is a nice dark picture, so I'll be able to pull that off. And there's one area here, even though I underexposed it a bunch, that the highlights are still blown out here. And so I had another picture that was way underexposed, and it had the detail here. So that's why you want to take at least 3 pictures of something you want to paint, so that you'll have all the information available to you, and you don't have to fake it, unless you want to. Yes?
Just what kind of board and surface are you painting on the wall?
This is homemade. I make my own ground. This is watercolor paper that I put my ground on. I mounted it to some, it's called door skin, but it's real thin mason. It's real thin, a real thin panel that I can just, it's lightweight, and I can just dry mount the watercolor paper onto it. But usually I use, it's called,
Luan.
it's just masonite. I was trying to think of the cool name for it, but it's just masonite.
Cardboard.
And I just rough it up really, really good with the coarsest pastel I can find, and then I coat it, and that's usually the surface that I paint on. So, anything else? I'm going to start there.
Do you dry mount with a press, or do you have a spray?
I have an old dry mount press that's maybe 20 or 30 years old
Lucky.
that I've had forever. But there's so many ways to mount things onto things. You spray, Miracle Muck, things like that, PVA glue, that it's really easy to mount things onto. Like if you have a sheet of watercolor, it's really easy to mount it onto a masonite or door skin or some kind of paper support or whatever. And you just need to weight it with some books or something like that for about 24 hours, and you're just good to go. It's very low tech. Okay, here we go. This is about 500 yards from George O'Keeffe's ranch house in Abiquiu. There's a whole set, as you're driving up towards Chama on your right and you drive through Ghost Ranch and stuff, there's a whole panorama of cliffs that early in the morning and late in the afternoon are just awesome. During the day they look kind of blown out because the sun's coming straight down, but if you're there around 8 o'clock or in the morning or around an hour or so before sunset in the afternoon, it's just beautiful. So if you ever want to go plein air painting someplace where you're guaranteed to have something pleasant to paint, go up to Abiquiu. You can camp there. They have rooms. It's just a great place, and specifically Ghost Ranch I'm talking about. So, and this is maybe a couple of miles from Ghost Ranch. So I'm just going to start.
How do you feel about questions during your demonstration?
Fire away. I mean, the more excuses that I can make if the demo doesn't work out, the better. And in the picture, this is very, very dark, and I don't want it to be quite this dark, so I'm gonna make sure that it's lighter, but I want it to be light enough for this part here to really show up well. So this is a pretty medium dark neutral gray. And the one thing about this surface is that it's very highly textured, and it does a lot of work for me.
What brand of pastels do you mostly use, or will you be using on this today?
I use all kinds of different pastels. I have Great American, Schminke, all those. Probably my favorites are Great American and
Terry Ludwig.
Terry Ludwig. I have my portable teleprompter right
I'm a shill, but I know all the answers.
And you can see all the texture that the paper makes for me. And the reason I like this is because most commercial papers are just very homogenized. The surface is really, really, really smooth, and I just like the texture. It just, as I mentioned just a moment ago, it does so much of the work for me. And the other neat thing about soft pastels and this textured surface is it allows me to do what essentially is glazing with a really, really, really light touch here. And of course, if there's any time, any place where I don't want a lot of detail, there's also the detail or texture destroyer, which you can just sort of change the values of something just by lightly going over it.
Paul, have you lost your fingerprints yet?
I did once. There used to be a paper that was just really, really, like, it was almost sandpaper. I was still learning how to paint pastels, and so I really, literally had a smooth spot with a couple of little red spots on it. Kitty Wallace. That all went away because the stuff that she used to make her paper, I guess, came from China, and China is at the time was undergoing a huge industrial expansion, and so they just soaked it all, whatever that material was, and she couldn't import it anymore. And that's when I started making my own surface anyway.
Do you add a ground to the watercolor paper, or just use the texture of the watercolor paper?
Just the texture of the watercolor paper. But when I use hardboard, I do add a lot of pumice to, I use gesso, pumice, and then there's some stuff called
Coarse molding paste?
No.
Fiber
I have
paste.
used coarse molding paste, that works. It's called fiber paste. And what it does is it allows there to be a little bit of texture, and it also kind of makes it feel a little bit more papery. And so that's what I generally use on masonite. So it's usually 1/3 water, 1/3 gesso, and 1/3 pumice, and then whatever I need in terms of fiber paste or something else like coarse ground to make it the right feel. And then it usually ends up being about the thinness of cream, milk, somewhere in between there. And I usually put at least 3 coats on, sometimes 4 if I feel it doesn't. I feel the surface every time I put a coat on the hardboard. And if it feels like paper, then I know I have enough coats on it. So if I just put 1 coat on, it usually doesn't get the job done. It's usually 3 or 4 coats.
Does it dry quickly?
In the summertime, in about 5 minutes, yeah. I just take it outside, set it on the ground, and it's drying. So coating doesn't take any time. In the wintertime, I have this little portable heater that I lean things against, and it'll take about 20 minutes or so for everything to dry so I can recoat it again.
Do you still use your little foam core blenders that you used to create?
I still use them, yes. And I also still use these little eraser things, and I'll try to explain why I use them as I get to it. And of course, everything you do with pastel is touch and feel. So with soft pastels especially, the amount of pressure that you use when you're painting just makes a ton of difference. And one thing about, one disadvantage to my surface that I consider as an advantage is I can't layer it as much as some of the commercial surfaces because there's so much tooth in the panel that you can just keep applying pastel forever and ever. With this surface, I get about 3 layers, occasionally 4 layers, and then I can't really put any more pastel on. And the advantage of that is that you have to really think about what you're doing. It makes things a lot simpler visually if you're not spending a lot of time building up or making things light and dark. If you can just make things light or dark in the first couple of tries, then it just ends up being so much nicer and such a more pleasant looking picture than if you've loaded it up with lots of pastel trying to make things light or dark. And of course, the best way to get around this, somebody did this once years ago when they were doing a demo. They had this little thing of canned air with a nozzle on it, and then they put a burst of air on it, and there was this big cloud of dust. When it got rid of the pastel, you could overpaint it some more. And sometimes I want to smooth things out, which is what this little foam thing is. You can come up when I'm done and look at it. But it basically just blends things. If you can see what else happening here. And almost all the pastel painting I do is with the side of it. I rarely ever use the point part of the pastel or the small part of the pastel. And that's one thing. I was taking a workshop back in the late 90s when I was president, and Elizabeth Mowry came out and did a workshop, and I was sitting there with my painting going, dee, 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 dee. And she says, Paul. She said that really well, Paul. If you want a more expressive mark, use the side of your pastel. And it just, in about 30 seconds, she changed the way I paint. And so she was my best friend forever for a long time. I really appreciated that. It was so sweet. Paul. And one of the things about pastel that I really like is that you can mix them on your painting, just sort of like you can do with oil paints. And sometimes when you're oil painting, you'll put down a color, and it's not the color you need, but you can load your brush up with a different color, and since it's still wet, you can just drag your brush down that over the color with the new color, and it mixes together so nicely. And that's one thing about this surface in particular, but in general, that makes pastels so interesting, is that you can blend one color into the other so easily. if I can reinforce something, Desmond O'Hagan did a Zoom demo last month, and if I can reinforce something that he said during that Zoom demo and what he'll probably tell you during the workshops, is he rarely ever uses white, white, or black, black. And that's, when I talk about protecting highlights and shadows, that's really critical to remember is in real life, and you realize this when you're plein air painting, in real life, there rarely is white, white. Even clouds that they're brightest are still a step, possibly 2 steps off of bright white. The only time you see bright white is if you stare with your jaw, with your mouth open to the sun for about 10 minutes. And the only time there's really a black, black is if you're locked in a room and the lights out and the power's out and there's no windows. And that's the only time there's ever really a black, black. All the other times in real life, there's not quite black and not quite white. And when you're painting, and you pick this up really quickly again in plein air painting, is that you want to, at least in my case, I don't want to put in a dark, dark or a white, white until I, or a light, light until I absolutely have to. And when I'm painting the high part of midtones, I try to keep them a little bit darker than I think I should, just so that when I do put a bright color on top of it, it really stands out. A really good person that's an artist that's really good at this is Sarah. In her paintings, you can just tell that she's compressed the highlights a little bit and then added a bright color on top of it, and it's just magical how that happens. So. If I embarrass you, that's just too bad. In fact, the lightest color I have here is kind of a warm gray, which is sort of that color right there. I lied, there is a little bit lighter color that I have. And a lot of times when you do use a really, really dark color and you put it over a mid-tone, it doesn't come out, because they mix as you put them down, it doesn't come off as being black or really, really dark, which is, again, a good thing to help you protect your shadows.
Paul, for your information, it's 11:35, so you might be aware where you are.
I know where I am.
Oh, good, good.
But that is about as good as it's going to get.
Do you always start from the top and work down, and do you always
Yeah,
use-
because pastel does, if I start from the bottom and work up, the pastel does, so it's going to fall down on where I've already worked, and sometimes that changes things, not for the good, so.
You always use a dark base, a black or
Always.
gray?
I always use dark black, dark purple, dark blue. I always start from it. Even when I'm oil painting or acrylic painting, I always start from a really dark surface. And I discovered that. I was at the Del Prado Museum back in the late 90s, and I was looking at Titian and Tintoretto and all these guys and reading about them and looking at their paintings, and they started from a almost black ground and literally glazed everything up from there, and their paintings would just take weeks and weeks and months because they had to let all these really heavy glazes dry. But the effect is unbelievably luminous. And I'm not sure in oil paintings today that anybody remembers or knows how to do that. It's just kind of a lost art.
you step away so we can get a quick photo?
Pardon? Is that good?
Paul, is this how fast you paint usually? Like,
No.
are you? I was like, wow, 45 minutes.
I'm in overdrive. I'm a very, very deliberate painter. I mean, if I were painting this in studio, this would probably be about 3 to 4 hours worth of work instead of like, what, 45 minutes or something.
Wow.
So, but you know, plein air painting teaches you these things.
"15 minutes."
No pressure.
No.
Tell us about your hard edge trick.
Pardon?
Tell us about your hard edge. How, you, in that what you were gonna share, you had something unique to get a hard edge?
Mostly I was going to talk about protecting shadows and highlights.
Yes.
There aren't really many hard edges in this painting. And a lot of times I go out of my way to make edges indistinct. Like this. Because that's another really great thing about this surface is that you don't have to worry so much about straight hard edges because they just don't happen. I should modify the question that Sarah asked me about how fast I paint. If the demo turns out well, yes, this is how I paint. This is a really dark area of the painting that I'm glazing back up with like a medium dark, very rich purple pastel here.
Do you prefer to work from a printed photo or a digital photo?
I used to work from a printed photograph, and then I was visiting Albert Handel's studio, and I noticed he had a monitor set up right next to where he painted, and it dawned on me that he was using a digital image, which is much, much better to use than a printed image, because on a screen monitor, there's just such a greater value range than on a print. And also, if you use any kind of photo adjustment software like Photoshop or whatever, you can literally have different layers, and you can have a layer that's a little bit lighter and a layer that's a little bit darker, and you can switch between layers depending on whether you're working on shadows or highlights or whatever. So, yeah, I have a monitor set up next to where I paint, and I've probably been doing that for about 3 or 4 years now. So, this is pretty much it. Any questions?
You brought spray, fixative, and I'm wondering if you use it in your process and how and when?
I can't do it in here, but when I get home, I will touch spray fixative right around in here, more or less in this corner. And what that's going to do is it's going to make this area just a touch darker, and this area darker and a little bit more saturated, and maybe even I'll spray up into here a little bit. But this whole area right in here will end up being just a touch darker, and you can do that with spray instead of trying to kill yourself glazing. You can also glaze it. I've done this before. You can also take like a deep purple pastel pencil and very carefully kind of do the same thing by very, very lightly glazing it in.
And,
But it's a time-consuming process.
and in the process of glazing, would it darken?
It'll darken it. It'll also, there's an advantage to using spray fix in that it doesn't destroy what's underneath it. But if you're using a pastel pencil to glaze things, it tends to, at the very least, soften everything around it because you're moving pigment around. And at the worst, you can literally obliterate things with the glaze, which is what glaze does in a lot of cases. And in some cases, when you're glazing things dark, black to a dark area in areas like this, you don't want a lot of detail in there anyway. So it doesn't bother me to use a pencil to glaze. It's a nice shortcut to use fixative.
And you'd want to darken that area because your focal point is up there.
It just makes this area better off, just how I made these areas darker to set this off.
Would you continue to paint on this?
To me, it's a plein air painting.
Okay.
And so, to be honest, about 75% of my plein air painting just turn out awful. But I'm there to learn, so I don't care. But every now and then a plein air painting turns out nice, and I'm happy. And this turned out pretty decent, all things considered.
Very nice.
45 minutes.
Yes.
Thank you.
Sure. You have a particular brand of fixative that you prefer?
I use
Krylon.
Oh, here it is, Krylon. Krylon workable fixative. There are other brands out there. Krylon's good because it doesn't make things shiny. You can and I should caution you when you're spraying fixative on your pastels, be really careful, because if it hits an area where there's a lot of pigment, it's just going to get glossy, which as soon as anybody who knows anything about pastels sees a little glossy mark on your pastel, they think you're some sort of slug or whatever. You don't know what you're doing, but just be very careful when you use a fixative.
Okay.
Anything else?
Terrific.
Did you tell them about your demo at Millicent Rogers?
Oh yeah, I'm doing another demo. Here's a mini vacation for everybody. You can drive up to Taos on the 28th of August at 1 o'clock, and I'll be doing a demo at the Millicent Rogers Museum. And as a bonus, I'll be doing a different picture. So,
What time did you say?
1 o'clock
It's on a Sunday.
on a Sunday.
Thank you.
That's great.
Thank you very much.